All right. Hello, everybody. On today's stream, I am going to be responding to a video that Erik from Testify put out yesterday. In this video titled Ehrman Exposed a Deceptive Gospel Contradiction, Erik talks about the ending of Mark and how he thinks that the ending of Mark makes Ehrman deceptive. Let's take a look at the video together and then see what we can discover about it. The ending of Mark.
Bart Ehrman might be the most recognizable New Testament scholar on the face of the planet, but when it comes to the Gospels, I wouldn't trust Bart any more than I would trust gas station sushi.
So we'll stop it right there and just say, okay, starting off kind of oddly aggressive there, Erik. Ehrman is a scholar, and Erik, I think of your channel as being mostly scholarly. I really do. I try to engage with you in your comments, and this isn't my first response video to you, in a scholarly fashion. And you just coming out the gate talking about how you don't trust Ehrman more than gas station sushi is like a little weird. It's like a little not scholarly, perhaps. And I just find it odd for such a scholarly channel like yours. So let's see why Erik doesn't trust Ehrman more than gas station sushi.
Doesn't mean that he's always wrong, he just constantly needs to be fact-checked. Just because he's a renowned biblical scholar doesn't mean that you can always take him at his word. Here is a minute-long clip of Bart on the Myth Vision podcast exploiting the ignorance of his audience.
Ah, boy, here we go.
A lot of people on the kind of more skeptical side of reading things say that Mark doesn't have a resurrection narrative. It's not true. Mark does have a resurrection narrative. The women go to the tomb after Jesus has been buried. They go on the third day, and the tomb's empty. A young man there tells them that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and they're supposed to go tell the disciples that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. Verse 8 of chapter 16 says, "And the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid." Boom, and and so Jesus is definitely raised. There's a resurrection narrative. What there's not are appearances of Jesus to the disciples afterwards. In Matthew, they go off and tell the disciples, and the disciples go up to Galilee. They meet Jesus there. It's just the opposite.
We are laughing.
So Bart wants to create a contradiction by having the women in Mark never say a word to him.
Okay, let's stop there. So he played the full clip, which, is good because I think a lot of lesser folks might try to take things out of context. You can't take anything out of context if you play the whole clip. So hats off to you there, Erik. But you start off by saying Ehrman wants to create a contradiction. I don't think that Ehrman wants to do anything with the text other than just look at the text for what it is. Ehrman's a scholar. He's not some kind of like atheist apologist. Erik, you're an apologist, so you want the text to say certain things. Of this, I'm relatively certain, and we will see more about how you want the text to say certain things as we go through this video. But I don't think that Ehrman wants the text to say anything. I don't think that Ehrman wants to create a contradiction or anything. And Ehrman hasn't even talked about a contradiction. He says that the women go and they tell nobody because that's exactly what the text says. When you read the text, it says the women go and they tell nobody. Then the story ends. Now, evidently, they did tell somebody because we have a gospel. We couldn't have the Gospel of Mark without the women having told anybody, right? Because evidently they told, unless they wrote the Gospel of Mark, and then they told people when they wrote the gospel, at least, right? Because the gospel got out. But I just find it like super weird of Erik to talk about how Ehrman wants to create a contradiction. I don't think that Ehrman wants to create a contradiction. I think that Ehrman's just reading the text. All right, let's keep on listening.
To anyone. It's as if Mark was shutting the curtain and saying, "All right, show's over, everybody." But Mark saying that the women said nothing to anyone for they were afraid following the discovery of the empty tomb doesn't necessarily mean they didn't tell the disciples. Mark says that they were specifically told to tell the disciples and Peter of what they saw. While their fear may have initially prevented them from spreading the report widely among unbelieving Jews, it's psychologically implausible that they would have remained completely silent about such a monumental event. Now, obviously, Mark implies that they found out from the women at some point because, after all, he is writing about it. That's just common sense, and even Ehrman himself admits as much. But did Mark really intend to end his...
And that's the point that I just made. Ehrman does admit that clearly the women told somebody at some point because we have a Gospel of Mark. And I'm glad that Erik admits as much. And so I don't know what Erik's talking about yet. Now, we'll keep watching the video. And Erik's whole point, I think, to me, is kind of speculative. I think that's the word I'm going to use to describe it. But let's let Erik keep going. I just wanted to note that Erik does admit that Ehrman doesn't say that clearly the women never told anybody because that's what the text says. No, we have a Gospel of Mark. Clearly the women told somebody, right? So, okay, no disagreement so far. So, no disagreement. Why the heck is Erik talking about how he trusts Ehrman less than gas station sushi? Well, he's going to explain. Let him get back to it.
His gospel at verse 8, like Ehrman says?
Well, that's debatable.
Nearly all scholars now agree that the long ending of Mark, from verse 9 through 20, wasn't part of the original text. That's not at all controversial, but there is some disagreement among scholars regarding the question of whether Mark 16:8 was the original intended ending of the gospel. Several scholars believe that verse 8 represents a place where the narrative was cut off, either was never finished for some reason, or the original conclusion was lost. So why do some scholars...
Okay, this is the main thrust of the video. Some scholars, according to Erik, say that the Gospel of Mark's ending at 16:9 is not the original ending. He admits that the overwhelming scholarly consensus is that the Gospel of Mark ends at 16:9. Okay, so why do some scholars think that the original Mark actually had some kind of ending? It's not the ending that we have today, but it had some longer ending than what we know of from the earliest manuscripts. Why? Do we have some kind of historical evidence? Well, spoiler alert, we don't. But I'm going to let Erik explain. Erik, take it away.
Scholars think that. Let's take a look at the passage again. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So how would we expect Mark if he were to continue here? In order to understand, we need to take a look at the way that Mark normally writes. He has a pattern of making blanket statements before adding an exception. Let's take a look at a few passages. Mark 5:37 says, "He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother." Mark 9:8 says, "Suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus." Mark 9:9 says, "As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one what they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead." Mark 10:18, "Why do you call me good?" Jesus asked him. "No one is good except God alone." And Mark 13:32, "Now concerning the day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." So what does this suggest about the ending of Mark?
So Erik's point here is that the Gospel of Mark ends with the women went and they told nobody. The end. But a lot of other places in the Gospel of Mark it says but, except, and these prepositions or whatever my Catholic school teachers are, rolling in they're not dead, but they're rolling in their graves. Because the Gospel of Mark at other points says this but that, this except that, this and that, then the ending is not the real ending? What? This sounds super, super speculative to me. Is this really the evidence that we're using to suggest that there's some secret ending that we don't know about? This seems like really, really flimsy. Now, Erik does go on to list other things that he thinks is evidence, and I'm going to let him get to that. But the fact that he's leading with this, Erik is leading with, well, the gospel says except, and it says but, so therefore the ending of the earliest manuscripts is not the real ending? Erik, this is wild speculation. This is not scholarly. It's not scholarly to call somebody less trustworthy than gas station sushi either. So I guess you're on brand here, Erik. Let's keep listening.
Mark's gospel, it's entirely plausible that the original ending of the gospel ran something like this. "And they told no one, for they were afraid, but running to the disciples, they told them all that they had seen and heard." Well, then, that sounds a lot like Matthew 28:8.
Where the heck did you get this from? You just pulled it out of thin air? You just invented a new ending to Mark that there's no manuscript evidence for? Erik, if you're just going to invent additional words at the end of the Gospel of Mark, then this isn't the Gospel of Mark. This is the Gospel according to Erik. This is the Gospel according to Testify. Read the text. What does the text say? What does the text not say? If you're going to try to make the text say something that it does not say, then you are inventing your own gospel. This is not the Gospel of Mark anymore, Erik. You can't just add things to the gospel because it would be convenient for you to do so. I mean, Protestants have been doing that for, 500 years at this point. Whoa, shots fired at the Protestants. But actually, they've been removing books that they don't like, so it's almost like the opposite. Erik's like some kind of like new Protestant. We're going to add words to the gospel. Or actually, alone, right? Didn't the Protestants add the word alone to faith alone? Anyway, I'm just shocked at, because here's the thing. Testify is a good channel. It's a good channel. I like to think that I am I like to think that I give credit where credit is due. And hey, wannabe scholar, by the way. Some of my favorite, my absolute favorite scholar of the New Testament is a Catholic priest, Father Raymond Brown. One of my favorites is Mike Licona. Mike Licona is an evangelical Protestant. I love Dale Allison. Dale Allison is Christian in like some sense of the term. But I like a ton of Christian scholars. And I think here that Erik from Testify is kind of just ragging on Ehrman for not having like views that are in line with like evangelical Protestantism, which is pretty weird. Let's let him get back to it.
But Ehrman wants to create an impression that Mark is contradicting Matthew here. But there's more that we could add here. In Mark's gospel, we see a repeated pattern of silence or requested silence, followed by proclamation. This silence in Mark's gospel never sticks. For example, in Mark 1:44, a leper is charged to say nothing to any man, but is also instructed to go and show himself to the priest. But Mark says that he shouted his healing so loudly that Jesus couldn't even enter into town openly. Similarly, when Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, those present were told not to broadcast the miracle, but it's clear that the people in the house who witnessed the event couldn't be prevented from discussing what they saw. Furthermore, in Mark 7:24, we're told that Jesus entered a house and would have no man know it, but the fact of his arrival couldn't be hidden. Finally, when Mark reports that Peter, James, and John were instructed not to share what they saw on the Mount of Transfiguration, he does not suggest that the rest of the 12 were also meant to be excluded from the revelation for forever. New Testament scholar Robert...
Okay, so I'm going to pause it there just to say a few things. So this, I think, is better than what he led with. What he led with was kind of just wild speculation. Here he's backing it up a little bit. But still, Erik, just because at other places in the gospel, there's like this theme of like going and not telling anybody, but then they told everybody, like that's kind of evident by the fact that we have a Gospel of Mark. So that's not entirely surprising that like the Gospel of Mark would end this way because we have a Gospel of Mark, right? No need to add anything to the end of the Gospel of Mark to create the Gospel of Erik, right? I just think that that's like it's weird to accuse Ehrman of like being less trustworthy than gas station sushi and trying to like purposefully confuse his audience just because Ehrman admits that Mark ends where Mark ends. Like, yes, Mark ends where Mark ends, and Ehrman knows this and he says it, and he's not deceptive because he holds some kind of majority scholarly opinion. I think that's absurd. This is where we get into some of the meat of the situation. And I do want to see if I can pull up any like live chat things right now. I've been trying to get something. Let's see. Can I? Maybe not. I'm trying. Let's see. If I go up here, does this work? Well, kind of. We can kind of see the live chat. Do you guys see? Yeah, you should. So I'll just say what's up. What's up, Christopher? Nitty, Wannabe. And I saw Daniel was here earlier, but Daniel had to go. So just want to say hi. All right, we'll get back to the video.
Robert Stein also contends that Mark did not intend to end his gospel at 16:8 because it would leave unfulfilled prophetic statements and shift the focus away from Jesus, which goes against the highly Christological nature of the gospel. It's for these reasons and others that scholars like Hort, Gundry, Witherington, Wright, Croy, and Edwards think that Mark 16:8 represents a spot where the narrative was interrupted, never completed, or lost. But for one reason or another, Bart never clues his audience in on this. Instead, he chooses to turn this into a contradiction. Rather than letting his audience know that there's some scholarly debate about this, he presents it as if it's the only view that scholars know about. Now you might say to yourself, come on, Erik, cut the guy some slack. Just because he's a scholar doesn't mean that he's just read everybody on this particular topic. Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but Ehrman cannot plead ignorance here. The view that I'm discussing was also the view of Dr. Bruce Metzger. Metzger was...
All right, I'm going to pause it there, and I'm going to actually switch views over to like a 50-50 view. And I'm going to do that because I have some information that I want to pull up. So let's switch over to the 50-50 view. Ooh, that's kind of the view I want. There we go. Okay, so Erik from Testify quoted somebody, a scholar by the name of Stein, Robert H. Stein, from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary at Louisville. The Southern Baptist Theological Seminary has a statement of faith. And if you click on the statement of faith, you find it says, we believe that God's word tells us the true story of the world and that the gospel is the true message of God's plan and the redemption in his son, Jesus Christ, who saves all and repent and believe in him and the power of the Holy Spirit. So Robert H. Stein wrote a piece from about the ending of Mark. And I should be clear here. I have not read this piece. Sometimes I'm really good about linking sources in my description. I try to be. I did check the description of Erik's video, and there's no sources to these papers. I haven't really tried to look for them. I'm just trying to, I don't get content out as much as I should. So I am doing the best with what I can, but I didn't check this. Maybe if I dig around for it, I can find it without paying for it, maybe. But regardless, I don't think it's necessarily shocking that somebody from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary would wind up coming up with some kind of plan to create some faux ending of Mark that is super similar to the ending that we know is not original. So essentially what these scholars are trying to do is they're trying to make an argument that the original ending of Mark is the same as the ending of Mark that we have today, even though we know that the ending of Mark that we have today is not the original ending. So they want to say it's not identical, it's just super similar. Okay. Yeah, maybe. But until we have evidence for it, I don't think that we can go around just stating that anybody who holds the majority scholarly opinion is less trustworthy than gas station sushi. Like, that's wild to me that you would use such inflammatory language about somebody who's just stating the majority scholarly opinion. Like, that's, I don't know. And so who was that other person that he mentioned? It was Bruce Metzger. So the thing about Bruce Metzger is that he was a pastor. Let's find him. Bruce, I'm going to, Metzger, there it is. Bruce Metzger, and we'll just go to his Wikipedia page. First of all, an amazing biblical scholar. I mentioned people like Father Raymond Brown. I mentioned people like Michael Licona. I don't think the fact that you are Christian means that your scholarship is shoddy by any stretch of the imagination. My favorite New Testament scholar is a Catholic priest, was a Catholic priest. So none of that is to say that I don't think that Metzger is trustworthy. But that is to say that I think that if somebody like Metzger holds an opinion that just so happens to support, and it's probably, and we'll let Testify get there, but even Metzger says, like, yeah, it may be there, But I have a feeling that, so Metzger passed away many years ago now. He passed away in 2007. So if Metzger was around today and we asked him, I have a feeling that he'd say something like, oh, there's no evidence that it's there, but it's possible that it was. And if that's the case, I agree. It could be possible that there was some kind of ending to Mark and we just don't have it anymore. But what's the time to believe? It's after we have the evidence, not before. Not before. So here we go. On April 11th, 1939, Bruce Metzger was ordained as a Presbyterian pastor. Metzger was a Presbyterian pastor. Also, he was born in 1914. So it's not as surprising that Metzger has some kind of view that is mostly in line with traditional, traditionally held beliefs. Like the original ending of Mark isn't the actual original ending, but we have something very similar that was just lost to history and then was re-added later. I don't know. But I don't think it's shocking that these committed Christians have beliefs that are in line with what other committed Christians believe. So none of that is shocking. Let's return to Testify and see what he has to say.
Others that scholars like Hort, Gundry, Witherington, Wright, Croy, and Edwards think that Mark 16:8 represents a spot where the narrative was interrupted, never completed, or lost. But for one reason or another, Bart never clues his audience in on this.
And let's go back and listen to some of those names. Give me 1 second.
Interrupted, never completed, or lost. But for one reason or another, 8 represents a spot where the narrative was interrupted, never completed, or lost. Witherington, Wright, Croy, and Edwards think that.
So I heard Witherington, Wright, Croy, and Edwards. Let's just pick Witherington because that name kind of sticks out to me. Let's go over to the Google machine and type in Witherington scholar, and then just see what we get. Ben Witherington III, a scholar at Asbury Theological Seminary, 30 minutes. It's in Wilmore, Kentucky. I live in Lexington, very close. So does Asbury have a statement of faith? I know that they do, so I don't even know why I'm looking this up. But Asbury Seminary, let's look up statement of faith. Shocking. Asbury Theological Seminary has a statement of faith. I'm not shocked when scholars who are bound by these statements of faith come out with something that essentially commits them to the predominant Christian opinion. And I mean, in where I grew up, there was no talk about this false ending of Mark. The ending of Mark that we have today was the ending of Mark that was included in the Council of Trent. Therefore, that's the ending that we have. So it's not at all surprising to me that certain scholars are trying to defend the position that the fake ending of Mark is secretly actually their original ending, even though we lost the original one and then it was got re-added later. I don't know. It makes no sense, but it's not at all surprising to me that that some of these conservative scholars are trying to argue this. That's not at all surprising to me.
Mark 16:8 represents a spot where the narrative was interrupted, never completed, or lost. But for one reason or another, Bart never clues his audience in on this. Instead, he chooses to turn this into a contradiction. Rather than letting his audience know that there's some scholarly debate about this, he presents it as if it's the only view that scholars know about. Now you might say to yourself, come on, Erik, cut the guy some slack. Just because he's a scholar doesn't mean that he's just read everybody on the dissertation at Princeton. They even co-wrote a book together. It's this book, the text of the New Testament. What does it say?
And so that's Metzger. I talked about Metzger earlier, so I'm just kind of skipping ahead here.
In the 4th edition, conclude his gospel, writer cannot believe of the evangel or good news. Metzger goes on to write that from a stylistic point of view, the end of a Greek sentence with the word gar is extremely unusual and incredibly rare. Only a few examples have been found throughout the vast range of Greek literary works, and no instance has been found where gar stands at the end of a book. This is the 4th edition of the book. In the original 3 editions, Metzger was the sole author, but Ehrman was added as a co-author in the 4th edition. So Ehrman absolutely knows better here.
Well,
agreed. I think that Ehrman does know about Metzger, obviously, right? Didn't Ehrman study under Metzger? because Ehrman got his PhD from Princeton, right? And Metzger was a professor at Princeton. I could be wrong about that, but of course Ehrman knows about Metzger, and of course Ehrman knows about this argument. But this is such a fringe view, Erik. It's such a fringe view. There is no evidence of this like secret ending to Mark that you keep on talking about. I will admit that the fact that it ends with the Greek word gar and that that's a rare ending, that's like the best argument that you've suggested. But just because there's a work that ends in a word that's like a rare word to end on doesn't mean that there's some kind of secret ending. It just means that it ends in an unusual fashion, right? You can't just go adding words to the end of a gospel just because it ends on an unusual word. And in fact, there are, now I don't know them, but there are other texts that end with that word. So it's not like it's the only one. It's not like it ends like in the middle of a sentence or something. If it ended in the middle of a sentence, I would say for sure there's definitely words that are missing that we just are lost to history. But it doesn't end in the middle of a sentence. We have manuscripts that just plain old end there. So I have no reason to suspect that there is some kind of secret ending that we just was lost to history. We have full manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, many of them. And all of the earliest manuscripts end at Mark 16:9. Adding an additional ending to Mark is a theological move done for theological purposes. It is not a historical move. All right, we're almost at the end of the video. Keep going, Erik.
Well. How the turntables...
So why is Ehrman leaving out inconvenient facts? Ehrman has been talking about this contradiction since Jesus Interrupted came out about 14 years ago, and he's still repeating it to this day. I'm constantly being told by atheists that non-Christian scholars are basically like Spock. They're just...
So why did Ehrman leave out this inconvenient fact? It's not a fact. What fact? What fact, Erik? The fact that some fringe scholars have this opinion that there is some secret ending to the Gospel of Mark that we just don't have. And you're quoting people who died, like, you know, I mean, 2007 is not that long ago, so perhaps that's not the strongest argument, but the overwhelming consensus of modern scholars is that Mark 16:9 is where Mark ends. And calling Bart Ehrman deceptive is just really weird. Really, really weird, Erik. Again, I like your channel, Erik. You're a great scholar. And I'm going to call you a scholar because you collate everybody's work and you put it into really good formats, and I enjoy engaging with it. But I just find your assertion that Bart Ehrman is less trustworthy than gas station sushi to be a really, really weird comment, especially considering that your arguments for the secret ending of Mark are pretty speculative, and Ehrman just holds the majority scholarly opinion. So I guess you think that like the majority of scholars are less trustworthy than gas station sushi. And I guess you think that unless you take this statement of faith, then you're less trustworthy than gas station sushi, which is so ironic. You know, if you don't swear fealty to some presupposed set of beliefs, then you're not trustworthy. But all right. Erik is going to go on to make a point about how some atheists treat all non-Christian scholars as if they are like totally impartial. And Christopher in the chat was making that same exact point. Let's see if I could pull that up. Yeah, you can kind of see the chat there. But yeah, and you know, fair enough. Ehrman is not neutral in the sense that, you know, he's ex-Christian. I'm ex-Christian. Everybody comes into everything with like some sort of bias. So I don't think that it's insane to I don't think it's insane to say that Ehrman is not totally unbiased. I just think it's weird to call him less trustworthy than gas station sushi. If I can read Lacona and if I can read Father Raymond Brown, then you can listen to Ehrman without resorting to insults. You know, that's all I have to say about that. All right, Erik, take us away.
Just researching the objective facts and giving you the real story. They're never hiding anything. Right. Listen, the whole point of this is not to rag on Bart or say that he's just a terrible human being. He's a mixed bag just like the rest of us. Some of us are just a little more mixed up than others. The whole point of this is that you can't just take a scholar's word for it and assume that they're just giving you the totally unbiased truth. You have to cross-check people's claims, whether they're Christians, agnostics, atheists, or whatever. Do your own homework. I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you so much for watching.
All right, and I'll just end by saying, yeah, and I mean, Ehrman would be the first person to tell you to do your own homework. Ehrman would never tell you just to take him at his word. Ehrman would tell you to go to the sources. And so I just found this whole thing kind of weird. And I just kind of wanted to respond to it. Erik, I'd be super happy to talk to you. I've made other videos, well, I guess just one responding to you in the past. It was about the Greek word oikumene in the New Testament. Probably didn't see that one. My channel's tiny. That's fine. But hey, if you ever want to talk about this stuff, Erik, I'm totally down. And I mean this sincerely. I'm a big fan of your channel. Sincerely. I think that you have a really good knack for collating scholarly opinions and then presenting them in a way that is entertaining and succinct. That being said, on this video, I do firmly believe that your theology is leading your belief here. You seem to have this view that Metzger alluded to, that there is some kind of additional ending to Mark that's been lost to history. There's no evidence of this additional ending to Mark. This like some kind of ending that matches the ending that we have now, which is, you know, kind of funny. But there's just no evidence for it. And the time to believe in something is after we have evidence for it, not before. But you believe it before we have evidence for it. And I think that you believe it before we have evidence for it for theological reasons. The case for the resurrection would be a whole lot better if Mark included a real resurrection. Now, to be clear, Mark does include a resurrection narrative. It's just that there's no appearances. And that was the only point that Ehrman was making. In fact, Ehrman was saying that there is a resurrection in the Gospel of Mark. And there is a resurrection in the Gospel of Mark. Ehrman agrees. Ehrman's only point is that the Gospel of Mark contains no kind of like apparitions after the resurrection. It's just, hey, there's some kind of resurrection. The women left, they tell nobody. That's it. End of story. And that's where Mark ends. And that is where Mark ends. And Bart is not less trustworthy than gas station sushi because of it. If the Gospel of Mark included additional details, the case for the resurrection would be better, no doubt. But Mark only includes what Mark includes. And a biblical scholar is not less trustworthy because he admits what Mark includes and he admits what Mark does not include. In fact, Erik, your willingness to believe that there is some kind of ending to Mark that's been lost to history without any evidence makes me think that maybe you're trusting in things because you hope that they're true. I'm afraid that your theology is taking precedence over history and what the text actually says. Again, Erik, I would be super happy to chat with you about this sometime if you ever wanted to talk. I'm legitimately a really big fan of your channel. And that's all I have for today. Thanks, everybody.